Hello there. Good evening, everyone. Um, I decided to research about Bach's cello suites further so I could understand the music more profoundly to help others and myself be able to play it on double bass. And so the name of my essay was Bach, Double Bass, and Scordatura, Practical and Historical Solutions. So while I was investigating into Bach's cello suites, I researched about historical awareness or historically informed performance practice. And I discovered some critical reviews of double bassist recordings of the cello suites. And what I did was I used those resources to make some decisions about how to play the cello suites on double bass, and then I use those resources again to support those decisions. Later in my essay, I took a technical look into how to be able to play those chords on double bass, the differences between all the different editions of cello suites for cello and bass, and then I investigated the Anna Magdalena Bach articulations from the text. So the first thing I came across in my research was historical awareness, or as the Society for Historically Informed Performance puts it, HIP. And what is HIP? And that's supposed to be a joke because that's actually a Tower of Power song, which is like super rockin' and funky. But what is HIP? The Society for Historical Performance of Boston, Massachusetts states that HIP means performing music with the technology and performance conventions of the period when the music was composed. So they typically play on antique instruments or instruments that were created in the likeness of these historical instruments with what we know. And we can see in the picture there, that is the Croatian Baroque ensemble, and the nice musician lady right in the middle there is playing a viola da gamba. And what they use is, besides these instruments, are musical treatises, which are kind of guidelines for how to play from those periods. And they cover subjects such as note length, rhythmic, emphasis, and ornamentation. And they're written by musicians such as Di Ruta, Caccini, Leopold Mozart, and we've all heard Dr. Warden mentioned Quantz, Johann Joachim Quantz. He wrote one of the definitive manuals for performance practice in his time, and he plays flute. So in the middle of the 20th century, historically informed performance became very popular, and people were using the term authentic a lot. And they were saying, this is the first time that Beethoven's been authentically performed, or this is the first time Bach's music has been ever heard like it's supposed to be. And so the famed musicologist and music historian, Richard Taruskin, had a problem with this. And basically he wrote many essays about the term authentic in the journal Early Music. And he argues that it's basically impossible to completely replicate this music as it was in its time. And it's impossible to perform this music in the modern day devoid of modernity. And so basically that's true, because if at very least you could never perform that music in the social context that it occurred in, it'll never be the 1700s again. So they come to Richard Taruskin comes to the conclusion that these performances, even though they're deemed authentic, really are a blend of modernity and historicity. And so what does that have to do with the double bass? It's because we're playing these cello suites that are steeped in history, and we're going to be playing them, I'm going to be playing them on a modern instrument because the double bass is the youngest of the string family. And after I did some research on what it means to be historically aware, I decided to research to find some critical reviews of bassists that had already done recordings and how they did them. And I found 3 reviews in American Record Guide from the late 90s and early 2000s, in which author David Moore reviews Bernard Salles, Gerd Reinke, and Richard Hartshorn. And a lot of these reviews were pretty unkind, so I wanted to learn what not to do and what to do. And so in the review for Bernard Salles, he says that this music on the double bass as performed by him is not a revelation. We learn nothing new here. And that he ultimately sounds like an elephant groping in the wilderness. And I would like to note that Bernard Salles did change a few of the keys to A major and A minor to accommodate the bass, and he did omit a lot of notes from those chords. So I moved on and I found a review about Gerd Reinke, which was actually much more scathing. And David Moore said that the piece was rearranged to fit the bass and not the music, to the point where it was unidentifiable in some places. So basically he displaced the melody. Sometimes he displaced it by 2 octaves, and he tried to keep cello tempi, and the author David Moore described it as slapdash. Lastly, the last thing that he said was, "I have seldom felt nauseated by music, but this does it." And so he omitted chords and changed the melody and made everything fit the bass, not the other way around. So I started to see a pattern about what not to do. And the first review I actually found was of Richard Hartshorn. And Richard Hartshorn is the first double bassist to record the cello suites in their entirety in the register and key that they were written. And David Moore noted that he had good intonation, a nice feeling for the music, and some of his problem solving was very clever. And so I would like to share a little bit of Richard Hartshorn's playing of the 5th Suite Prelude, which was also the focus of this piece because it has, the focus of this essay because it has the most amount of chords in it. And so that's Richard Hartshorn. And I would like to note that he actually uses Scordatura tuning to achieve the feat of playing Bach's 5th Prelude on double bass. And I know that not everybody in our class is a string player, so I didn't address this in my essay, but I wanted to take a moment now to define what Scordatura is. And so Scordatura means it's basically any other tuning on the instrument besides its standard tuning. So for instance, the double bass is tuned E, A, D, G. If it was tuned E, B, E, A, that would be considered Scordatura. And in my essay, I argue that the double bass should be tuned just like the Scordatura that's called for in the fifth prelude, which is C, G, D, G. And we'll note that the chords in this piece are actually impossible to play voiced as written without that Scordatura, even on cello. So the middle illustration is Hugo Becker's edition of the cello suites, and the top line is written for Scordatura, and the bottom line is written for standard cello tuning. We can see in the downbeat of the second measure that the F3 is actually missing from that chord because it's impossible to play without down tuning that A string on a cello. So in my essay, I argue that we could tune the bass the same way, but down an octave. So C1, G1, D2, G2. And without doing that, if we leave the bass tuned in its standard manner, it's impossible to play the music as written. And we can see that in Mark Burnett's edition of the cello suites, which is the top score of music. And we can see right on the downbeat that you get a grace note for a C instead of the octave Cs that you can see conversely in the lower score below it in the Becker edition. And if you follow along in the Burnett edition, we can see that the downbeat of the second measure has only 2 notes and the actual chord is 4. So there's quite a bit omitted on a standard tuned bass. And in my essay, I take a look at many of these chords to see which ones are possible in the use of the Scordatura on double bass. And in order to drive that point home, I took a picture of my hand playing the slurred chord, and that's what the final illustration on the bottom is both halves of that chord being played in standard thumb position bass. And I would like to note that I am a very average bass player, and I was able to play this with about 15 minutes worth of practice. And so here's my recording of the first couple measures to demonstrate that this piece is actually playable. And that was a B diminished over C chord. That is extremely difficult to play, especially on double bass. So after I figured out that it was physically possible to play the music as written using Scordatura, I took a look further in my research about articulations, how to make this work on the bass. And they're not often used. I'm not sure exactly why, but the articulations in the text, Anna Magdalena's facsimile, are not frequently used. You don't see them in the Burnett or the Becker edition, nor the Starker. And so what her edition calls for is a lot more separate notes, which really benefits the double bass because the double bass has the shortest bow in the string family. And so if they're all separate, we're using less bow, and that makes it a lot more doable. And while I was looking for methods to perform this music, I was also looking for recordings to model my performance after, or anybody who's interested, their performance. And I discovered Christophe Quan, who is a French cellist and conductor whose specialty is historically informed performance. And here we can hear him play the articulations from the first few measures. So if you follow to the left, you can see the articulations in the text and listen to it. And what's interesting, I mentioned earlier about historically informed performance, is that truly it's a blend of modern and authentic performance practice. And what's interesting is we could hear when Christoph Kwan played those chords that they were actually separate. He had to play one or two notes at a time, play the bottom and then play the upper, and that means that he's actually playing a rounded bridge. He's not playing a flat bridge like a Baroque cello. So I use that recording as a model as well, because it's a blend of modern and authentic performance, which is what the performance on a double bass is going to have to be like. So ultimately, Scordatura was the greatest solution that enables the performance of these chords from Bach's Fifth Cello Suite, the prelude from the Fifth Cello Suite, as written in their original key on double bass. And in combination with the articulations and the ease of use from Anna Magdalena's manuscript, the bass and the Fifth Cello Suite becomes playable. After exploring the historical awareness, critical reviews, solutions and recordings from other bassists and cellists, I believe I now have the tools necessary to start to begin to make a performance edition, which is really what I wanted to do with this project, but I don't have enough time. Hopefully for my recital at the end. So ultimately, with the use of Scordatura and playing these pieces as they're written in combination with the text articulations, I believe that a authentic performance arises on an instrument that the music was never intended for. Thank you.